So Bitcoin security is already a difficult challenge. Recall that we want to make it as easy as possible for us, the owner of the Bitcoin, to be able to access and move that Bitcoin, whilst making it as difficult as possible for an attacker to move that Bitcoin. And this is a tug of war, right? There's trade-offs. You make it too easy for you to be able to move a Bitcoin, you leave copies of your seed scattered around multiple properties, and you increase the probability that attackers can be able to move your Bitcoin. Make it too difficult to move the Bitcoin, perhaps you leave the only copy of the seed in the middle of a field, thousands of miles away, and you forget the location where you left that, say, logbox. Then you've not only prevented an attacker from moving the Bitcoin, you've also prevented yourself from being able to move the Bitcoin. And if no one can move the Bitcoin, then no one effectively owns that Bitcoin anymore, right? You can't exchange that Bitcoin for goods or services if you can't move the Bitcoin to someone else's address. So security is already a difficult challenge. Now when you bring inheritance into the mix, it makes it even more challenging. At least with the previous scenario, you don't want the Bitcoin to move to your attacker under any circumstances, right? So you want to keep a hold of your Bitcoin and you want to stop another party from gaining access or being able to move the Bitcoin. In the inheritance setting, you're introducing parties as descendants where you don't want them to be able to receive your Bitcoin whilst you're alive and whilst you're not incapacitated, but assuming you do unfortunately die or become incapacitated in the hospital, etc., you want your heirs or descendants to be able to access your Bitcoin then. So they're kind of in this grey area where it's like they're not malicious like an attacker, but they're also not perfectly innocent like you are, just wanting to keep a hold of your Bitcoin. You're introducing parties that are kind of in the grey, where you want them to be able to access your Bitcoin under certain circumstances, but you don't want them to be able to access your Bitcoin in other circumstances, whilst you're still alive, whilst you want to be able to spend that Bitcoin without your descendants being able to steal your Bitcoin. So it's a complex scenario. Now, there are various options with Bitcoin scripting for how you could approach this inheritance problem. If you were to do a single key, single signature, well, if your descendant has access to that key whilst you're alive, they can move your Bitcoin whilst you're alive, right? So this doesn't work. You could say, well, I want them to have access to the key if I die, but then how do you ensure that happens, right? Anybody who you leave that key with is able to move that Bitcoin, and any intermediator, assuming you die, who has access to that key can move your Bitcoin before that key gets to your descendant. So a single key, single signature solution is clearly not optimal. So then when we move into multi-sig, let's say like a 2 of 3 or a 2 of 4. In a 2 of 3 setting, let's assume that you have 2 of the keys and you give a key to your descendant, right? So in the hope that when you die, your descendant can gain access to the funds. Well, the descendant at this point only has 1 of the 3 keys and so can't move your Bitcoin. So you're still in the similar scenario to the single sig setting, in that you need a way of getting that second key to your descendant post you dying, and you don't want them to gain access to this second key before you die, because then they can move your funds when you don't want them to. So you're kind of in a similar scenario to the 1 of 1, where, okay, you've given your descendant a key in advance, but they still need a second key to be able to move that Bitcoin, and how do you get that second key to your descendant, assuming that you die or you're incapacitated? So an alternative would be a 2 of 4 multi-sig, right? With a 2 of 4, you could give a key to one descendant and another key to another descendant, and you keep two of the 4 keys yourself. And so this is better in that, assuming you die, there are 2 individuals, 2 descendants, who have enough keys to be able to gain access to the funds, to move the funds. And there's no problem of needing to get them a key post your demise, right? But there is still that downside that if the 2 descendants collude before you die, whilst you're still alive, they could steal the money, right? Because they have 2 of the 4 keys, and they could move the funds if they were to collude against your wishes. So again, not ideal. There's also this question of, well, do you tell your descendants that it is a 2 of 4? Right? If you don't tell them that it's a 2 of 4, then it's possible that you could say, here's this key, it's really, really important, don't lose this key. But they only learn that there's Bitcoin locked behind a 2 of 4, say on your death, right? So you could leave some details in the will saying, there was this 2 of 4, you know that key I gave you many years ago, you need that key now to be able to move your funds with your descendant, with the other descendant, the information that it's a 2 of 4 is only declared post-death. So that could potentially work. We're getting into like more solid ground, but again, leaning on this assumption that the descendants won't find out it's a 2 of 4 it's not perfect either, right? So what is a better solution than all of these would be a degrading multisig, and this doesn't have widespread support in wallets and in vault-like schemes today, but with the introduction of Miniscript, there'll be a lot more hardware wallets, hardware signers, and software wallets supporting this. So the degrading multisig is better because you could have, say, a 3 of 5 that becomes a 2 of 5 after 3 years. So let's assume that you die within a 3-year period. The descendants would only have to wait until the time lock expires, so the 3-year time lock expires, and then they'd be able to move the funds with just 2 signatures with the 2 keys, right? So we've got a 3 of 5, you've given 1 key to one descendant, another key to another descendant. Within these 3 years, the descendants can't move the Bitcoin, even if they know the details of the multi-signature scheme, because they only have in total 2 keys and they need 3 to be able to move them. But in the case that 3 years has passed and funds are still behind this address, and let's say you've died in this time, your descendants just have to wait for the 3 years to complete, and then they can move the Bitcoin with this 2 of 5. So I do think degrading multisig is the best solution to this inheritance problem. There's still like information and subtleties that need to be ironed out, because it's like, well, do you tell your descendants of this scheme? At what point do you move the funds into a different address? How long do you leave it? Do you leave it a day before this 3-year period expires? Do you leave it like 6 months before this 3-year expires? Then if you move it to a different address, do you use the same keys that you had in this previous degrading multisig? So there's still a few things to iron out, but to summarise, I do think this degrading multisig is the best solution that we have for Bitcoin inheritance. I think it gets to that optimal point, like that showing point where it's you're not trusting your descendants to not collude and move the Bitcoin before your death, because they have to wait for this 3 years to expire before they have enough keys to move the funds. So yeah, I think long term this is going to be the best scheme for Bitcoin inheritance.